Hello.
Hey, Jim, how are you, man?
Good, how are you?
Yeah,
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Yeah, you sound great. Loud and clear. Hello, I'm Steve Joel, a radio host and Warhammer nut from New Zealand. Welcome to another episode of my podcast series, 40K Game Changers.
No worries.
I'm sorry about all the messing around. Have you guys just hit, like, daylight saving or something?
Dude, it's like, okay, it's so I didn't realize this, but not only do some places not have daylight savings, but daylight savings also has different days depending on where you are in the world.
This series is supported by the Frontline Gaming Network, and I'm very grateful to them for that. The Frontline Gaming Store is where you get your tickets for the Atlantic City Open. The event is officially a super major now, and it would be amazing to be part of that, wouldn't it? There are just a handful of tickets left. If you're even thinking about going, you'd better be quick. Go to frontlinegaming.org or follow the link in the show notes to this episode.
We've been playing in this like tabletop simulator event with the in Greek Hammer, like Team Canada. So we scheduled the game before daylight savings. So like he's like, okay, it's this time now. I'm like, okay, well it's this time here. And the game was the next week, so we schedule it, but then we have daylight savings on Sunday.
Yeah.
And then I get to the game and the guy's not there. I'm like, where is this guy?
This is episode 12, and today's guest spent a long time as the world's #1 player and is a prize-winning painter as well. And as you'll hear over the next 40 minutes, he has some great stories. Man, what's going on in the background for you? You got crime happening.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just I live across the street from a fire department.
Like, okay, as long as they're not coming to take you away, that's okay.
Oh, I hope not.
Yeah. Just another thing to note before we start. Normally, I pride myself on the research that goes into finding out about every guest before we chat. But as you're about to hear, I messed this one up pretty big right at the very start. So let's meet today's guest. He is the winner of multiple majors, including the Wet Coast and Adepticon, as well as more GTs than you can shake a force stave or a black staff at. He was ITC champion in 2019 and ITC Hobby Track champion the same year. And he created a list that featured Plague Bearers and Thousand Sons characters that was copied by thousands and named after him all over the 40K world. He is, of course, Jim Vesal. Thanks for joining us.
Hey Steve, how's it going? Thanks for having me. And just a small correction,
Oh.
I actually came in second on the ITC going into 2019. Richard Siegler actually ended up winning it.
Why did I think you were ITC champion then?
I'm not sure. I came in second. Yeah, just I mean, I'll take it. I'll pretend I am.
Sure. But Hobby Track champion that year, right? Which we can come to a little later on.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to start away from 40K though, like quite a long way away.
Sure.
After flirting with a career in law, Jim Vesal devoted himself entirely to food. You flirted with a career in law. Was that the first thing that you wanted to do?
No, actually, I don't know if I just watched a lot of sci-fi as a kid, but I had this idea in my head that, and I was around I think around the time when they had first mapped like the human genome. I can't remember exactly what age I was, but I found that super interesting. Like, and obviously I watched a lot of things like Gattaca, sci-fi. So I actually wanted to be a genetic engineer. That was like my very first kind of big career aspirations. And
Wow.
my first year in university, my first year in university was actually spent doing biochemistry. And after realizing how much I absolutely hated it, the one course that I took that was one of my electives that I found really interesting was actually an ethics course, a philosophy ethics course. And so that kind of led me into switching from a science major into liberal arts. And I ended up doing my degree in undergrad in applied ethics and philosophy. And my plan was to take that into law school.
Wow.
But yeah,
that's quite a journey. That is
yeah.
like it's I feel like I wanted to say that what you've ended up doing feels like so far away from 40K, but then what you went into university with, that's a massive turnaround, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is, I always loved food, and my family grew up, like, I'm a first generation immigrant to Canada. I was born in Istanbul in Turkey, And so I came to Canada when I was 2 years old. So Canada's all I've ever known, but my mom She was, single mom raising two kids, barely spoke English, so we didn't grow up with very much money, and I always was hungry,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so in high school, one of the courses that you could take was, and in it was like cooking classes. And so I used to always take them because you would make cakes, you would make food, you'd make all sorts of other things, and then you could get to eat it. So
Yeah.
for me, it was like an opportunity to eat, basically, right? It was an extra opportunity to get like some food. So so that's actually kind of where I guess my cooking career started. It was in high school doing these kind of foods classes, and then when I did my work experience, I think I was a 12 or 13 years old. I washed dishes at a Ricky's restaurant. It's like a burger chain out in North America. And so when I went to university, I basically had moved away. So I grew up in Vancouver, and I'd moved to Victoria, British Columbia, which is just across the water. And I moved back to Vancouver when I was 22. And in order to make friends, I decided, I was like, I like food. I'll get a job in a restaurant. And so I got a job as like a dishwasher, and then basically worked that job while I went to school full time. So I moved out when I was 17. 2 days a week, I would go to school, 4 courses, and then the other 5 days I would work full time in the restaurant. So 7 days a week I was like either working or going to school. And the big reason I decided not to end up actually pursuing law was because at the end of my degree, which took me about almost 7 years, because some semesters I would skip, some semesters I would take like one course just because I was exhausted and I needed to work more. So my degree took a lot of time to kind of get through, and I think I was around 27 or 28 by the time I was ready to go to law school, and I'd been cooking this whole time. And so by the end of it, I was like an assistant chef to our chef, and they basically said to me, they're like, look, you have the talent, you have the ability, you have the if you want to be a chef, you could be a chef, but you have to commit to it. You can't do this. You've had one foot in the door, one foot out the door this entire time. You can't do both. So make a decision. And I knew at the time too, if I go to law school, there's no way I'm going to be able to be working. You're going to have to take out much more student loans, etc. So that was the point where I realized, having just been through almost 7 years of school, that going to school for another 5 years, 6 years was just not super enticing at the moment. And I figured, let's give this chef thing a shot. And if it doesn't work out, I can always go back to school. And here we are, 8 years later, and I'm, kind of today.
You're pretty well entrenched in this whole chef thing.
Yeah, I never look back. So
Yeah. So, man, I'm fascinated though by this whole. You wanted to be a genetic engineer. I think that's just most kids. If you ask them, for me, when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a superhero. And then and then shortly after that, I thought, well, that's not realistic. I'll be a policeman. And then, kids want to be astronauts and whatever. And then every now and then you come across someone who wants to be a genetic engineer. I think that's amazing.
Yeah. To be fair, it was not necessarily I think I'd watched a few too many movies with Mad Scientists.
Yeah.
The Island of Dr. Moreau. I don't know if you ever see any of those old movies where Frankenstein. I think my headspace was much more closer to those people than it was as some sort of positive thing for humanity. I definitely had it in my brain that I was going to create superhumans. And maybe that was why I love things like Space Marines so much, because I was like, yeah, I'm gonna be the Belisarius call of our century and create superhumans. So it was definitely not out of a sense of goodwill and love of humanity. It was out of a sense of creating some cool monsters and creatures.
Yeah. That's perfect, because you kind of get to do that now, which we will come back. As I say, we'll come back to that. But so I feel like outside of 40K, you play at the highest level, you paint at the highest level, but kind of outside of 40K, it feels like you bring that same attitude to what you're doing in your business. Are you a perfectionist? Is that kind of your thing?
I definitely used to be. So my position in my kind of company, I guess, that I am involved in now, I oversee. I've been doing my specific role for about 5 years, and I oversee about 5 different restaurants. I've opened 6 restaurants in 4 years, which is pretty intense when you think about it.
Yeah.
So I haven't actually been I do still a lot of recipe development and business development, but I don't actually work as a chef in the restaurants, and I haven't for about 6-7 years. And I would definitely say that when I used to be the chef, like when I was in a chef position where I was actually like working in the restaurant day in day out, I had a bit of a reputation to being a bit of a hothead. I definitely had a very high standards. Like everyone was basically disappointing for a lot of my career, and I think that was something that drove me to kind of the reason I was able to kind of succeed and be as successful as I was is because I had that kind of very like I put in everything 110%.
Yeah.
I will say over the last like 4 or 5 years, I've definitely mellowed out. I've definitely like learned to like relax a lot more and take a step back and um, not be so just like intense about it. Just because with five restaurants, trying to hold that amount of stress in your head for one restaurant is hard. Try doing it for a multi-unit company with multiple restaurants across in two countries in multiple cities. Like it's just the amount of like stress and like anxiety that can produce if you're trying to basically control too much
Yeah.
it's just impossible. And so I had to learn really quickly to kind of let go of that and just really trust the people that I worked with. And that was very hard for me because I'm still a bit of a control freak in a lot of ways. I like to be involved in just about everything that we do, even things that like our marketing team absolutely hates me because I always involve myself in like things that are totally not my department or I'm not really responsible for, but they always know that I have an opinion or I have ideas or suggestions or how to do things better. So uh, sometimes we get into some pretty heated fights.
Right. It's hard for other people too, right? If you're a person who, as you say, you put 110% in and you have a really high standard and you have an expectation that other people will do the same, but not everybody's there, and it's really hard for everybody else to kind of match what you're doing.
Yeah, I think I used to just assume if someone didn't care as much as me, like if someone didn't put in as much work as me, it's because they just didn't care. And
Right.
that was like a very toxic attitude to have. It's like, oh, if this person, if they make a mistake or if they screw up, it's because they just don't care, right? And so that was a very like bad kind of area time in my life, and I actually ended up even talking to getting professional advice on it, coaching and stuff, not like full psychological therapy or
Right.
anything, but I definitely went through a phase where I had to really fight those demons. And it was something that I still struggle with sometimes, right? Like if someone does a poor job or I still struggle with it, but I think being more detached from the day to day has really helped me
Right.
kind of manage that, I guess. So
And I've read in different things, different interviews you've done or heard in different chats you've had with people where your work kind of, and we're coming into the 40K area now, but I feel like a lot of people have to almost fight against their job to play the game because the job takes up so much, but it pays for the game we play.
mhm.
And for you, you get to travel with your work, so that helps. But the more I talk to you now, the more I feel like your work takes up so much of you and so much time. Do you think it works for 40K or against 40K? Does it help you play, or do you have to fight against it to get some game time in?
So definitely for it, and the reason is so I'm in a role like I'm an executive in our company, and my I work Monday to Friday, mostly 9 to 5. When we're opening a restaurant, we were this September, I'm very hands-on. I'm in the restaurant, maybe like 60, 70 hours a week for about 6 weeks, in and around the opening, kind of being there full time. But then the rest of the year, I have an office, I have a desk, and that level of normalcy is very, very rare in hospitality, in culinary, in like as a chef. That level of like consistency and normalcy is almost unheard of. And so,
Yeah.
most chefs, they work, you always hear these horror stories, right? They're working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, whatever. I work a fairly normal schedule outside of like, very small chunks where, we're doing like a restaurant opening, which it's not just me, it's like everyone in our organization, it's all hands on deck. Everyone's in there. So from that perspective, this job actually gives me way more time to work 40K play 40K because when I used to be like a chef and actually work as a chef, you go from 10 in the morning till 1 in the morning, and it's like when do you have time to paint?
Right.
You're just sleeping and eating and going to work. So this has actually been really good for my 40K, and like one of the reasons I was able to travel so much in 2019 was because I have vacation, and I can take weekends off, and I can, like, oftentimes, yeah, I would be traveling for work a lot of the time. Obviously, last year I did zero traveling for work. So, but yeah, in general, it's been pretty good. So I've definitely managed to sneak a few 40K tournaments in as part of my work trips, which has always been.
I was going to ask that. Do you sometimes, like, with work, you kind of spot an event that's going on and go, okay, we need to be in that town at that time? You kind of wangle it so it works, or does it work the other way? You go, well, I need to be there for work, and look, hey, there's an event that's going on not far from there. I can stay a few days longer.
Yeah, so I have a few stories of that. So in 2018, I opened a restaurant in Toronto, Ontario, and Toronto actually has a much bigger 40K scene than Vancouver, which is on the West Coast. And so I lived there for 6 months, and I managed, like, literally, as soon as I got to Toronto, I brought, like, my army, and I brought, like, a travel kit of, like, paints so I could paint while I was like living there. And there was a local event, and I post on the Facebook group that I just moved to Toronto, and can anyone give me a ride to the event? Because we're talking Canada here, so this is a 2.5 hour drive from the city. This is not right,
Yeah.
which is, for people that are in, like, England, they're like, "What? You drove 2 hours to an event?" I'm like, "Yeah, that's nothing. I'll do that every day." But so I ended up meeting a group of guys out in Toronto, and that kind of kicked off, like, a very great set of friendships. And then I was literally going to events almost every week in Toronto. But then sometimes we'd have a GT in Vancouver, and I would plan my trips home, because I come home every month or a month and a half for, like, a few days. I'd plan my trips back home on the events here. So I'd be playing events in Toronto and then fly home on through work for events in Vancouver, back and forth. Obviously, being in Toronto, I was close to things like, the only reason I even went to Adepticon was because I was within I think it was an 8 hour drive, which, again, sounds like a crazy amount of distance to go.
It really does.
But in Canada, that's not that crazy. And I think in America too, that's probably not that crazy. So Adepticon was like 8 hours from Toronto. I went to New York quite a few times because that's just on the other side. And then even a GTI won in California last year called Dice Hammer. I was down there for a trade show, and I decided to stay a few extra days because they had a GT kind of lined up with the trade show. So I stayed the extra few days, but I ended up winning the GT and then flying home on the Monday. So, it's been really beneficial in that sense.
I read that you did something like 22 events in 1 year.
Oh God, I think it was more than that. I mean, if you count RTTs, but it was up there.
Yeah.
It felt like at least twice a month I was going to an event. Sometimes three. There was I think a span I had at one point where I went to an event 6 weeks in a row.
Yeah.
And so it was very, like, I loved it, but it was like, there was very, like, one of the things that I did enjoy about last year, despite all the craziness, was just a very peaceful year. I spent it at home. I didn't travel almost. I didn't even get on a plane until I got on a plane in February last year, and I didn't get on another plane again until January of this year. So
Right.
I went almost the whole year without leaving the city, and that was just so nice. Like, it was so nice to just. I was exhausted, to be honest, by the end of the season. So it was nice to just have basically a year off from 40K. So.
Let's go back to the beginning, because I do want to come back to the 2019 season and everything that happened and all the other stuff. But right back in the beginning, little Jim, were you a nerdy kid, or were you a D&D playing kid? What were you like, in your younger years?
So I was a bit of a class clown, and because of that, I was kind of friends with everyone. So I was one of those kids that I would go play D&D with the nerds one day, and like Thursdays, and then I would go play basketball with the cool kids. Then I would hang out with, like, the goth kids. Then I would go to the smoke pit and hang out with the smokers. Then some days I would hang out with, like, the weirdo art students. So, like, I was very much a nomad. I never felt like I belonged to any one group. But because I was a bit of a class clown, and I was quite short. Like, I'm 5'11" now, which isn't, like, super tall, but I didn't think I really got my growth spurt till I was, like, I don't know, I probably like 13 or 14. Like, I was pretty. I feel like in grade 10, which I think in Canada you're probably 15. I feel like I was still like 5'2", but so I was always like this little tiny kid running around, just making jokes and then being part of everyone's group. So I was a little bit of a chameleon in that sense.
So you're kind of across all the groups. When did you get into 40K?
So funny enough, I actually started with Warhammer Fantasy. So that was my first introduction to Warhammer, and that was, I believe, I want to say probably 1998, 1999 at this point. I remember This was 5th edition Warhammer Fantasy. So I remember walking by a Games Workshop, seeing the models, walking in, and then playing a mega battle, which is, I guess, those things that they had, or like a demo game. I can't quite remember. It was the old box set with the Bretonnians versus the Lizardmen. And the manager that gave me that game, this is actually a funny story. His name was Owen Curtis. And Owen Curtis still today works as the head manager of Games Workshop, one of the Games Workshops in Vancouver. So
Wow.
23 years later, the guy's like a legend. Like, he's like gray haired now, and he was like this, like, and I was like a little 12-year-old kid. But yeah, that was my start in 40K. Into kind of Games Workshop, and then I didn't actually get into 40K until 3rd edition 40K, and that was primarily because I wanted to work for Games Workshop as obviously when you're 14 or 15 and you want to get a job, like a cool job, you're thinking is like, I'm going to work at Games Workshop. And so I started playing Chaos Space Marines, because obviously Chaos, that was my first fantasy army. Obviously it was my first 40K army. And then obviously this was just before, just around the time the Lord of the Rings license they picked up. So I think around 2001, 2002, when the Middle Earth, Lord of the Rings as it used to be called, came out. So that was my first touch into 40K in 3rd edition. And I did end up getting that job at Games Workshop. That was a very, very cool time in my life, working at Games Workshop when I was like probably 16 to 19 for almost 2.5 years. And it was like the greatest job you could have as a 16-year-old, being a Games Workshop employee, like getting to paint for money and playing games and just hanging out in the store all day. It was an amazing job. So and I have so many fond memories from that time. But and then after that, I went to university and I kind of quit for quite a while. So I stopped playing Warhammer Fantasy and 40K. I basically got out of the hobby. I kept everything, so I put everything in my parents' basement. You guys have heard this story probably 1,000 times. Gotten into girls, got into drinking, did my university. Like, it's like the pretty similar story that everyone. But like, I always kept my tabs on the hobby. Like, I had a few old Warhammer forums that I like. I think it's called the Warseer, maybe Daka Daka, Bolter and Chainsword. These were like forums that I still had in my bookmarks, and every once in a while I'd pop in and kind of see what was going on, but didn't really get back into it until 8th edition Fantasy, and then that kind of drew me back in around 6 years ago, back into the hobby. And that was finally at a time where I had time and money, and I was like, wanting to do some stuff. And so I went and literally grabbed all my paints and stuff from my parents' basement and had almost all my hobby stuff still. So it was a fairly easy thing to just start buying stuff and painting. And as soon as I picked up the brush, it was like love at second sight. Like, it was like revisiting a lost love. So I was hooked right away. And I did fantasy for a while, and then obviously that story, we all know how that story ended with the Age of Sigmar, and that kicked me back out of the hobby for a few years. And then obviously I started reading. Actually, the thing that got me into 40K was I took a 2-month trip to Europe, and I started reading the Horus Heresy series while I was in Europe. And I'd never read any of the books, and I didn't play 40K that much, but I was literally in Europe, and I think I started 2 months in. So I started on the first book, and I think I was like 13 books finished by the time I got home after 2 months. So
Wow.
like, whenever I was traveling on a plane, and I just remember being in Europe, I was like in Ibiza, and I could think like, oh, I want to get home and play 40K. Like, that
Wow.
was like literally like where my headspace was at.
Wow.
And I was like, I can't wait to get home and like paint models and stuff, like partying in Ibiza. So when I got back, I kind of this was just at the time when 7th edition was winding down. And so I waited a little bit. I started painting, but I didn't actually start playing till the drop of 8th edition.
I love the idea that you're at some party in Ibiza and getting invited to some after party, and you're going, no, you know what? I've got to paint models. I'll see you guys later. It's so good. And so, you pick up the paintbrush and you're back into it. By the way, if you're a chaos person, a fan of chaos, reading those first few Horus Heresy books, the Aaron Dembski-Bowden stuff is, man, that had to be amazing. Of course, you're going to get into 40K. Anytime you read a book and you connect with it, I was the same reading the Beast Arises series. I'm like, man, I have to start Imperial Fists. No, I have to start Black Templars. No, I have to start, every time I read an inspiring story, I go, I want to start that army.
It was funny. Like, I always think about when I really like, I've always been really big into the background for fantasy and 40k, but I've always found the 40k background a lot more interesting. Fantasy was a little bit stale. It's gotten, obviously AOS is the background, they've done a lot better job in the last 2 or 3 years, but 40k has always had the way better, cooler background. And I remember literally being like 13 and at a Red Robin, which is like a burger chain out here, trying to explain the Horus Heresy to my dad, and him just like, I was like, yeah, there's these 20 Primarchs, and kind of going through this whole, like, he was trying to be like a good dad, showing interest.
Yeah.
It didn't end up working out between me and my dad. We're a bit estranged these days, but at the time, I think he was like trying to be like, like, oh, like, here's something my son's interested, let me show some interest.
Yeah.
And I just remember like literally frothing at the mouth explaining the Horus Heresy to him, and just being like so hyped about it. And I was like 14, so it was very natural for me to, like, when the books started coming out, for me to like jump into the books really quickly as well. So
yeah. And then then you get into the tournament scene. So I feel like you were painting for a bit and you were enjoying maybe playing some games. When did you get into the tournament scene? Was that like a straight away thing, or did you avoid that for a bit? How did that work out?
Yeah, so when I played fantasy, I was pretty competitive. Even in my first go before I quit, like, I actually ended up winning like a few Warhammer Grand tournaments, which is what Games Workshop used to run back in the day. I actually won my first best painted in 2003 at the Calgary Grand Tournament. I think I was like 16 and a half or 17 years old. So then I painted an entire non-metallic metal Beastman army, which in retrospect is like totally mental.
Yeah.
At like 17, like, it was bizarre. So I was always into the event. And then with fantasy too, I actually had we had like basically like the North American like worlds or whatever, and I was supposed to go to represent Team Canada for that, and then it got canceled. Like, they blew up the edition basically that year, so they didn't end up having the event. So when I got back into 40k, I definitely, took me a little while to get playing competitively. I knew I wanted to play competitively, but I have had for the longest rule that I won't play with unpainted models, and that's even for practice. So that's something that I still very much practice, and so that means usually I'm not quite as fast on the like meta, as a lot of people. And I will never play with models that I've like put a half-hearted paint job in. Like, I paint everything to the same high standard, whether it's a cultist or a Primarch for the most part. And so it's really hard for me to quickly move. Like, I'm a bit of a slow ship in that regard. But once I kind of get going, I'm usually pretty like hyped up about it. And so that was kind of, I think my first 40k event was, I want to say like December 2017, using Index Thousand Suns. And I remember losing the game very badly. My first like 2 games. So
yeah. But so if that's 2017, by 2019 you're, excuse me, Richard Siegler, second place in the ITC. That's a massive and very fast-moving rise up the ranks. And I know you played a lot of events, but still, do we call that an overnight success, or did a lot of background work go on early days to get you up to a level where you're really competitive? Or did you just slot right in and start smashing people straight away?
Well, I think, so I'd mentioned earlier that I'd moved to Toronto in the summer of 2018. And the first half, as I said, so the first half, I played my first tournament in like 2017 December, and then the first half of the year I was in Vancouver. And Vancouver, as I said, I think I had 2 or 3 other events. When I moved to Toronto, actually that year at Wet Coast, which is an event I ended up winning the following year, I didn't even make it to the second day because we got so drunk on the first night. I just ended up leaving my army at the event and not even making it to the second day. Like, that was the kind of player I was back then. So I was not that serious about,
right.
And I ended up having to go to the hotel like 3 days after the event to get my army. The guys had packed it up very, very like nicely for me. So that was where I was in my game. I was very much like the guy that would go, just drink my face off. And it wasn't until I moved to Toronto where I started playing with like a lot of the ETC guys, the Scari's out there. Obviously there's a much higher caliber of player out there. And that was what really kind of, and obviously just having events, RTTs, GTs, and just being that just totally immersed in that tournament circuit. I think even in the tail half of that year, I think I did like 3 tournaments in the first half of 2018, and then I did like 14 in the second 6 months, right? Like the second half. And it was just because I started going to events with these guys, and that was where it really turned on for me. And yeah, and then I just kind of kept pushing myself, and I think my first actual GT win was not till like the January of 2019, and then I ended up winning like 4 GTs in a row, including Adepticon, I think was one of them. So that was like a weird kind of run, I guess.
Wow. And then, so
Yeah.
was this the Jim Vesal list? We've got to talk about the list.
Hmm.
Did this come to you in a stroke of genius, or was it, again, a thing that you kind of had to take things in, take things out, sort of, or was you just woke up one day and went, you know what, I think this would work, this concept?
Do you want to know the real truth? Breaking
Oh my
like
God.
exclusive here for Steve.
Yes,
So
yes, please.
yeah. So this is not like this whole list was not like my initial creation. In fact, for the longest time, I refused including any Nurgle. I used to hate Nurgle. I was like, God, the models are ugly. They're so gross. I've always been a Slanesh and Tzeentch player because I just love the color schemes. I love the bright contrast. I love the pastels. So for the longest time, I resisted putting any Nurgle in my army. And then I remember putting in 30 Plague Bearers once. And I was like, oh, let me try these Plague Bearers out. Everyone's saying they're good. And this is, again, it wasn't me coming to this. People were like, Plague Bearers are really good. And I'm like, all right, I'll give 30 a try, see how I like it. And literally I was like, oh my God, these are so good. And so immediately I went and bought another 30, painted those, right? And then just from there, the list kind of evolved. It wasn't so much that like I sat there, came up with the list. Like people kind of told me certain parts were good. Everyone knew Tzeentch Demon Princes were good and Thousand Suns were good. And I already played Thousand Suns, so I knew that. And the missing element for me was the Nurgle. And that was something that I was very resistant to at first because I just never liked Nurgle units. I just didn't like how they looked. I didn't like the models. And then after I put that first 30 Plague Bears, it was like a drug. I was like, all right, give me another 30. Give me the Nurglings. Give me the Sloppity Bob Piper. And it just kind of went from there. And then from there, I kind of just did a lot of different versions of the list, adjusting it to play my play style. So the Khorne Demon Prince or the Contemptor Sea Beam Dreadnought, which is very unique. Like people were like, what the hell is this thing? Those are kind of very Jim Vessel touches. But to be the truth, I've never been the guy that plays the bleeding edge meta lists because I generally kind of let people fall on their face a little bit, and then I'm very good at taking a list and then refining it and playing it at a high level and playing very technical. But I've never been the person. I'm not Sean Naden, right? Like I cannot create a list out of paper clips and rubber bands and go win a major with it, which is basically what Sean Naden does. So.
Right. So then what happens? You've got this list. It's a great list, and you win stuff. But then people figure out, or it either gets nerfed, or people figure out how to beat it, or maybe a combo of both. Then
Right.
what do you do?
Well, for me, like what actually happened for me, and this really belays like my second half of my season last year in 2019, which was two things happened. I had been on the top of the ITC for almost the entire season, so I think from the time I won Adepticon to probably the Pro Tabletop tournament, which I believe was in November or December of 2019. So for almost like 9 months. I was at the top of the ITC rankings, and I think Richard had slowly started to put together his wins, and eventually, after that win, he surpassed me, and then basically it came down to LVO, so whichever one of us basically were going to do better. But what happened is around August of that year, I just kind of was like, you know what, I want to start playing other things and playing with other armies and other lists, and start kind of just having more fun, because that list, it's effective, but it's extremely tiring to play. You're talking almost 100 110 models, and also this was right around the times that things like orcs had come out with the double shooting ludas.
Yeah.
Things like Ynnari were just destroying everyone with spears. Like Ynnari was always one of my hardest matchups. So I could still beat Ynnari, and I know Ynnari at the time was a bit of a boogeyman. My list actually still had all the tools to beat Ynnari, but like it was always a difficult. So I was finding like at the time, basically, unless I won LVO, there's basically almost nowhere for me to go points wise. And so I started playing more fun lists. I played quite a bit of the new stuff from like the Vigilus at the time had come out. So I was playing like Daradio Dreadnoughts from the Purge, Care of Don Husen. I was playing like Knights with Magnus and Morty. Like that was fun. Like just those fun like kind of throwaway lists. And then in September, and I went to open a restaurant. So for basically September to December of that year, I was totally out of the scene. Like I didn't play in a single. I don't think I played in maybe played in one event. So my 40K acumen was quite rusty. And then right around the end of the year is when the possess bomb list started to kind of come into vogue, and I was hearing whispers of that. So and Space Marines had come on the scene as well. The new Space Marine 8th edition. This was like Iron Hands days.
Right.
So the list was just in a decline, and I was very busy, and so I didn't get a lot of practice. And so going into LVO, I painted the possess list, but I think I'd played 2 games with it, and it was definitely not my style. It was very different than the style list I've been playing all year, and I definitely struggled with that kind of towards the tail end of the season. I just didn't have enough practice in, and I was so busy with work. That was a time of my life where work was a big priority, and so I didn't really care. I was very proud of like how I had kind of done that year, and I didn't think that I had anything else to prove at that point. And winning LVO, even if you're in the top 10 of the ITC, is extremely hard. So it's
Yeah.
probably one of the hardest events in the world. So I don't feel any sort of like I went in with very low expectations. And I was actually quite happy that I was second, because that meant all the pressure was on Richard instead of me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I think in any universe, second in the ITC is amazing. The other thing, there's a few other little things I want to touch on or ask about if I can. About a year or so back, there was a wee bit of panic about a stolen army at Pearson Airport, which I only saw on some sort of Reddit feed. What happened there? Or was that actually a thing, or is that just made up on the internet?
No, that's 100% a thing. So I was flying home from, I'm just trying to think, the Barry Bash. This was basically 3 weeks after I got back from Adepticon. I played in the Barry Bash. I actually ended up losing to TJ at the top table in the final. And I was in Pearson. I was exhausted, and I'm at the gift shop. And usually I'm super protective of my army, but I'm at the gift shop. I was going to get a bottle of water, and I literally my army bag was basically probably about a foot away from me. So not like far away. I didn't leave it like in another room. It was literally like maybe like a foot slightly out of my line of sight. And a guy came up to me and like distracted me for like 2 seconds. He asked me a question. I turned him to the other side, and then I turned back forward. I paid for my water, and I turned around, and my army bag was gone. And I like immediately went into this like crazy panic. I was like there's this feeling that hits you when something like that happens, where you don't quite believe that what's just happened, because like you hear about people getting their luggage stolen, and I have too. And so I'm usually very, very careful in the airport, and obviously you never think it's going to happen to you, especially like right from out from under you. It's one thing to leave your bag unattended and someone to take it. As far as I'm concerned, it was like one of those scams, or the distraction scams,
Yeah.
where people see that you have a bag and then you're actually a mark, right? This wasn't a simple case of me just misplacing and someone taking it. It was like literally someone like kind of singled me out. They saw my army bag, probably thought it was like film equipment or camera equipment, and then they like pulled off like a heist. So here I was running around the airport trying to find an army, to no avail. Talk to the cops, nothing happened. And then long story short, my plane is boarding, so I had to get on the plane. I couldn't stay. It was like the most devastating plane ride of my life, because I couldn't talk to anyone. Obviously I'm on the plane, so there's I lose 5 hours that I could have been looking for this army. And I put in a like lost baggage report to Pearson and all this stuff. Yeah, long story short, I'd given up on the army at that point, because they Pearson kept calling me saying there's nothing found. And then I was like, you know what? I have an event in like a month. I'm gonna start painting a new army. So I literally started this army painting project where I was like, you know what? I'm not gonna let this ruin my season. I'm gonna paint a new army, and that's what I did. And I had some really generous people reach out, help me out with. Dan from Red Dragon Games in Ontario actually literally donated me a few thousand points of stuff. The guys from Creature Caster were really just lots of people reaching out. So many people messaged me saying they had models if I needed models. Like the thing that sucked was losing my army, but one of the good parts was just the community support. And I've never been someone that's been super like, I don't want to say like popular, but like I've never felt like I'd be that kind of person that people would care about, because I've felt fairly unspectacular for anything. And so seeing that level of like care and like just outreach from the community was like super like it was super just like inspiring, I guess, and like really heartwarming, and like it just really made me feel really good, and it really took the sting off, because I'd never felt or experienced anything like that, where like random strangers were literally trying to like help me out. And that was just like, it was just like really emotional. It was like a really emotional experience, because it was so hard to process like what was happening. And and Sure enough, about 3.5 weeks later, I get a call from the airport. We think we might have your stuff. And I was like, I didn't want to believe it, but I sent one of my Toronto friends out to the airport to get it. And sure enough, they said they found it abandoned in one of the lounges. Like someone had taken it,
Yeah.
opened it, and then ditched it. So that was an intense experience. So I'm very grateful I got it back.
Yeah, yeah, but it is amazing the community, right? When the I feel like this community that we're a part of, when they step up, it's amazing. People in this community are generous.
Yeah, it's been really weird. Like I've been involved in lots of charity events over the years, and I've done a lot of like donations. And a lot of the events that we run out in BC, especially, there's always generally a charity component, whether it's some percent of the proceeds or there's raffles or whatever. And so I guess I didn't really realize that how rare that is. Like I think a lot of people think or thought that like that happens in all sorts of communities, different types of genres. But I actually feel like that's a very like wargaming thing to be so involved in like charity work. And like there's so many great organizations that do, look at Nova, right? Like it's one of the biggest
Yeah.
biggest in the biggest charity kind of organization. It started as a charity, right? And it's one of the biggest events in the world. So I really appreciate that about our community, and just this kind of sense of goodwill, I guess, of always trying to do good while we enjoy what we enjoy. So
The other thing I want to ask you about was Team Canada. I saw you were selected for Team Canada, and then I went to look at results for Team Canada, and your name wasn't on the list. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. I don't know if anything went down, or are you part of Team Canada? Or are you in the WTC or slash ETC team? Is that a thing or not?
yeah, so first of all, just for those of you that don't know, they just announced today that the WTC for 2021 has been canceled,
Saw that.
and
Yeah.
obviously last year it was canceled as well. So my initially I was supposed to play with them in 2019, but essentially I couldn't make it. Like originally I was supposed to be on the team, and just I just didn't want to. It was a very expensive trip at the time, and I'd already been playing so much ITC that like I wasn't able to put in the time and effort that I really wanted. So I ended up not being part of the team for 2019, even though I was given extended invite. And then I have been on the team the last 2 years, but obviously there hasn't been a
Right.
WTC.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping, and we're still we're all in a chat together, and I'm hoping for 2021. Finally, I'll get my chance after 3 years of waiting. But yeah, so I'm still part of the team, absolutely. It's just right now with the pandemic, everything's kind of thrown in a loop. So
I feel the other thing I wanted to do was, can we give a plug to Duplicity Paint Studios? What's your project at the moment?
yeah, so I've been I've always done a little bit of commission work. I'm not a commission painter, so I just want to make that really clear. But I did start a Twitch channel, YouTube channel called Duplicity Paint, and it's basically the home for weekly podcasts that I'm doing with David Koska, who's based out of Buffalo. He's like a similar-minded hobbyist and gamer as me, so we're both very into painting and competitive gaming. And then also be doing things like I've been broadcasting my stream games on TTS, and obviously just I've been doing nightly streams, paint streams, and just hanging out and trying to do hobby tips, and just kind of with COVID, it's been a thing that I've been wanting to do for a while, but I just haven't had the finally decided to get off my butt and kind of put it together. So and I've been doing some commission painting as well, which is a whole other beast that has been enjoyable as well. So if you guys check me out on Twitch and YouTube, it's Duplicity Paint on Twitch and Duplicity Paint Studio on YouTube.
I'm a big fan of your paintwork as well. Like the painting you do is amazing. I'm really amazed to hear that you won't play with, even in practice games, with armies that are not painted. I feel like, man, that adds a lot onto your prep time. But it's just it's so cool that someone has that stand and you stick to it.
Yeah, I think back when I started playing Warhammer, you weren't even allowed to play in Games Workshop with unpainted. So
Right.
that was a rule that they kind of got rid of like much later. But I kind of grew up in the culture of like if you play with unpainted, it's like shameful, and so that's always stuck with me. And I think you'd mentioned that I came second in the ITC, which is something that I'm incredibly proud of.
Yeah.
But the thing that I'm more proud of is coming second and also coming first in the hobby track, is being able to show that it is possible to be a great hobbyist, to really care about your painting and your like all those kind of things that aren't a lot of people think competitive gamers don't care about, and also play at the highest level. I think that's something that I'm more proud of than any specific result, is just being able to show that, and there's the true Renaissance man. And if people like Sean Naden who have won that award, I think every year at LVO since they've attended, those guys are people that I look up to, because for me, that is the highest level of the hobby, is being able to maintain both a great competitive kind of edge and also being able to be a great hobbyist. And it doesn't mean you have to be a good painter, because not everyone is born with that kind of talent, and I certainly wasn't. Some of my I posted a few of my older models from 2001 on my Instagram just to show people my progression. And so but I am very proud of the fact that I put in that much effort in both sides of the hobby. So
there are, whenever your name has come up with other people who are, when I'm talking about people I want to have on the podcast, I bring up your name, and every single person is like, you know what, there's just no one who can paint like that and play like that. It's very rare to find someone who paints as well as you do and also plays at the very high level you play at. People tend to be one or the other. You're the guy that proves that you can do it, although I don't know if very many people could do it like you do. But listen, and my bad for not touching more on the fact or focusing more on the fact that you won that hobby track, because that is such a big part of who you are and how you're perceived in the community. So thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I am a fan, and I love your work, and I love watching your games that you play and the spirit you play them in. Just keep it up.
All right. Thanks, Steve. I appreciate that.
My thanks to Jim Vesal for taking the time to chat today. If you enjoyed this episode, go find 40K Game Changers on Facebook, or leave a review on iTunes, or let me know what you think in the comments on my website, 40kgamechangers.com. Every follow, every bit of feedback really helps me out, and I'd appreciate it. And make sure you get to the Frontline Gaming Store for your tickets to the Atlantic City Open. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, I'm Steve Joel, and this has been 40K Game Changers.